Got it. Welcome. I'm Richard Smoley, and I'm here with a third in the series of webinars on the Kabbalah that we've been doing. And this time it is going to be on Yetzirah, the realm of the psyche, which is mostly what we've been dealing with up to now. But at the end of this, there'll be more comprehensive a picture for you to draw. Now, to go back over what I was saying last time, there are four worlds, and the first is absolute, which is the realm of emanation. Now, the Kabbalah is different from conventional Christian theology in that it teaches the doctrine of emanation. In this sense, it means that some of God's essence penetrates into the world. Conventional Christian theology insists that on a radical and unbridgeable gap between God and creation. So if you're used to thinking in those terms, this is where it differs. Obviously, Judaism does not have any, such prejudice. So that's absolute. That is kind of the presence of God in the world. Bria is the realm of spirit, of archetypes, of creation, literally. That is to say, as I said last week, the biblical book of Genesis, in its first book, has a description of creation in Bria, whereas the second book in there has it in Yetzirah, so it's talking about two quite different worlds. These realms are really all that easy to access for us. We are talking here, even these lower levels of these two worlds, generally of exalted mystical states and cosmic consciousness. Above a certain level, you're either unable to come back down here or unwilling or both. So that's why I haven't discussed these very much, because what I would have to say about it would be pretty speculative. So what we're focusing on in this course is Yetzirah, the realm of form and psyche, because it is the one that's kind of most accessible to introspection. This level here, materiality, your physical body knows how to operate, but your conscious mind doesn't have much access to it. I came across a line from Walt Whitman this week saying, I know not how I extract strength from the beef I eat. And that's true of him, it's true of you, it's true of me. Our nutritional system, digestive systems work perfectly well, but our conscious mind has no idea of how it's done, and if it ever tries to interfere in the process, it would just do more harm than good. So, again, this is the realm we're dealing with here. Keter, Chokmah, Binah, Hesed, Gevurah, all the way down to Malkut. In humans, it is the realm of the psyche. And this is something else we covered last week, which I'm going over. This is the lower face in Yetzirah. And cognition and perception can be seen here. There's sensory input, which is Malkut, that is to say the raw sense data. Your mind's capacity to recognize it. Your mind's capacity to respond to it. Your ego's capacity to make some conscious choice of what to do about it. So much, if not all, our conscious lives take place here. This is pretty much the state we live in all the time during our waking life. Sometimes, and we'll see why in a little while, material from these upper levels kind of leaks its way down and appear on the screen of Yesod. And that screen of Yesod could be seen in this particular case as operating from dreams. All the stuff is coming down. the barriers are a little bit looser during sleep because the conscious mind is not really active. So some of this material can come down and can display itself. You could say, since that's what dreaming is about. This ordinary cognitive state is sometimes called Katnut, the lesser state. The Triad of Awakening here is when an individual starts to become conscious. All of this, as I say, is to a great extent unconscious. And in fact, we'll see vegetative. All right. Sorry for that interruption. It was a matter of the usual technical difficulties. So thank you for your patience in this regard. So we're back here with the level of ordinary cognitive activity. And this is, as I said earlier, a rather vegetative state, as in vegging out. Because a lot of these functions are quite simply not very different from what plants do. Reproduction, digestion, absorption of nutrients, excretion of waste, reproduction, as I say. All of this is vegetative, although we certainly like to think of ourselves as being much higher than the vegetables. This is the Triad of Awakening. And in a certain sense, it's called the level of the animal soul, as we'll also see. But let me go on to, yes, here it is. This is the animal soul, and this is called Nephesh in the Bible. Biblical Hebrew has 3 words for soul, which we will see, and they're not identical. Nephesh is the life force. It's equivalent to roughly to what the Theosophists call the Etheric Body, and like the Etheric Body, it is not immortal. We are, in the words of William Butler Yeats, fastened to a dying animal. And this, again, as I said, is a vegetative soul. In some esoteric texts, it's called the man plant, which is a funny kind of name, but it can be explained by a Jewish legend. And I'm not going to read all of this, but you can read it for yourself, but it's all about this thing called the Adneh Sadeh. Where's my arrow? Okay. The Adneh Sadeh, which literally means something like man of the field. It was a plant that was indistinguishable from a man, except for the fact that it had green blood and didn't have free will. It knew no temptation, nor could it ever be righteous, which is an interesting point I'll go into in a minute. This is from the book. This is a charming book published about almost 70 years ago called The Lore of the Old Testament. But the stories themselves are found in the Talmud and in the Jewish philosopher Moses Maimonides. And there's a lot of wonderful lore in Judaism. Now, I am not saying that there really was. Oh, by the way, this thing isn't around anymore, according to legend, because it's sort of kind of disappeared after Noah's flood. Evidently, the Adneh Sadeh did not get Noah's memo, or if you like. But without committing ourselves to the existence of a creature like this now or in the past, it does show that we have, and at some level, we are vegetative. All the other animals are also, in this sense, vegetative. They have something else. And this is the animal soul. And in this level, you're not really concerned exactly with these sorts of basic life issues like reproduction and eating. You start to focus on what other things that we share specifically with the animals, like dominance, status. As far as we can tell, there's no sense of dominance or status in the plant world. Plant may grow larger than another, but it probably doesn't see its greater size as a matter of status. Whereas animals do have hierarchies and actually remarkably complex societies. I saw an interesting thing on the web a day or so ago, just talking about like some city of octopuses. Apparently these octopuses who are rather solitary eventually kind of sometimes just get together in one kind of big octopus conclave. So, but then octopuses are very intelligent and, they are animals, so they too manifest the side of this, whereas the geranium in your house probably doesn't. And here's where the free will is possible. All of this is pretty automatic. Even your ego is pretty much little more than a collection of pre-recorded responses to perceived stimuli. And it's at a fairly superficial level. Going on here, let's start to look at this triad. Gevura and Hesed have to do with deeper emotional responses. They are not like superficial feelings, which are down here, but this is deep emotional responses. So let's go back to this process. Malkut goes up to Had, which has never seen this before, whatever it is, like that strange sea creature. It goes up to Gevura. It's kind of asked, well, is this, do I like this? Do I not like this? Is it safe? Is it not safe? And Gevura says no, kind of goes back here, and then the response starts here. So that, at this level is Gevura. Here are some of the things associated with it. Strength, which is what Gevura literally means. Your capacity to say yes or no is very much a part of your strength. They did a study on AIDS sufferers a couple of decades ago, in the days when it was still beyond any kind of cure, and they surveyed patients who survived and patients who didn't. And one of the characteristics of the patients who survived was that they recently had said no to something, whereas the people who didn't were not really capable of saying no. So maybe it's just like some loathsome vanilla pudding that the hospital is giving you for dessert, but it's still, a sign of some strength, to say no. It can be severe. It does have to do with judgment. Again, judgment at a very primal level. This is where your moral sense of right or wrong is implanted, which, as you probably have noticed, is not entirely coincidental with society's notion of right and wrong, which from your point of view is conditioned here. This is your innate conscience, shall we say. And times these two conflict. The most famous instance in literature is in Huck Finn, where Huck is helping a runaway slave named Jim. Now, helping a runaway, this is the 1840s, it was set in the 1840s, so it's against the law to help a runaway slave. And by the way, it's morally bad in that culture, right? And so Huck is on this raft thinking, well, I guess I really ought to turn Jim in, and then start to think, well, Jim has really been a good friend, I really can't do that to him. That chapter ends with this Huck saying, all right, I'll go to hell. So this is the conditioned thing. You're supposed to turn in runaway slaves. This is your inner conscience. And this gives a very dramatic sense. These things hopefully don't conflict too much, but as we're all well aware, they can and do. Okay? In another sense, Gevura is the limits of anything. Rather a rare but powerful Kabbalistic book called the Phoenician Letters, has a quote, "You may not use a pepper plant to make bread, neither does a man use corn to flavor his food." Those are the limits in those things. That is, it's kind of built into its structure. So again, judgment, right and wrong, swift emotional responses. Let's look at something else. Going back here, sensory input, recognition, judgment, like or no like. But what if you do like it? Well, then it goes over to here, which is Hesed. It is your positive feeling. This is love, compassion, mercy. This is something you look out at something you find beautiful and you want to reach out for it. So it is love in a deep sense. Although, as you know, the word love is applied to any number of things all over the place. So if you love something, decide you love something, it goes down here to your essence and you respond accordingly. Again, it goes down to the self through response, the ego makes a decision. So now we're actually kind of seeing how this thing functions as an integrated whole. These kind of little arrows and paths are, of course, extremely oversimplified because lessons like this have to be extremely oversimplified. If you were really going to portray this accurately, it would be like these would be going off almost like neurons firing. I mean, obviously there are no little spheres like this in your body or even in your psyche. This is just a schematization of it. But like a lot of schematizations, and more than most, I think it's helpful. So love, mercy, expansion. Now, if we put all this together, we see that these are what are called the emotional triads. This is negative emotional triad. This is positive emotional triad. These are your deep responses. That, to some extent, are innate, to some extent come from your experience of the past. This is what Jung called the personal unconscious. This is right beyond this is the threshold of consciousness. Well, this is well above that. So now it's unconscious or conscious only, or you're only conscious of it at rare moments, or how it manifests in, say, dreams. Here, this may be kind of a visceral response, positive response, and some of this may be quite arbitrary. I was reading a book by a psychiatrist, which he was treating a patient who'd been abused, and she said, "Well, I can't work with you because you have dark hair, and I was abused by a man with dark hair." So it is partly conditioned, but it's also stuff that can go very, very deep and that you're not aware of it. The whole idea behind Freudian and Jungian analysis is to bring materials like this as much to consciousness as possible, so that these areas are not completely split off, which they are in probably the most ordinary of day-to-day people, no matter how rich, successful, or famous they may be. So you could think of these as the emotional triads. The next level is the soul. This is another Hebrew word, neshama. And what does it consist of? Well, what you hate, what you love, and your true essence. And these are complex dynamic. And that is what you are at the deep soul level. As I say, conscience is seated here. again, the deep-seated conscience. Did you know that in French, the word conscience means both conscience and consciousness? Fact for the day. Anyway, this is again at a very deep level, and it can be nourished or not. You don't really want to poison this by negative things that would, shall we say, hurt you at the soul level. When I was younger, I found that horror movies affected me that way. I don't know, there's something that it was not good for me to watch. Now I can watch horror movies without any particular problem, and if you've seen a few, you realize that there are only 2 or 3 basic scripts anyway, and the rest is all just changes in special effects and whichever teen actor happens to be featured. But there was a time I just had to stop watching horror films. Another case, which is a little more contemporary, is, of course, I always thought child abuse was bad, but until I had children of my own, it did not horrify me as viscerally as it does now. And I don't even just want to see movies that relate to that. I know it exists. I know it's much more prevalent than anyone likes to dream, but I don't know. I mean, so I have to, in a sense, protect myself from it. Well, yeah, I do. I do. I'm not denying that it's going on, but I have to pay attention to what's good for me. Next is the collective unconscious. Now, these are beyond the personal level. And these consist of, well, let's look at Jung's definition. Again, I'm not going to read all of it. It is the matrix of all conscious psychic occurrence. It includes the psychic life of our ancestors right back to the earliest beginnings. In a sense, it's the collective body of psychic experience. Now, although it is unpopular to say so, there are certain levels to this collective unconscious. One is universal. Another is racial. That is to say, a given people has certain experiences in its collective unconscious that other nations do not have. And this conditions those responses very, very deeply. If you accept this fact, suddenly a lot of the problems in the world start to look at least a little clearer. Because, you'll see, Americans are for good and bad, both often very short-sighted. We don't really dwell on the past nearly to the extent that most nations do. But there are nations where they're still angry about losing a battle 700 years ago. And since they lost this battle to the people next door, they hate the people next door because they lost this battle. This is all in there. Now, nobody likes to talk about these days because it's ideologically unpopular, and people like to forget these things exist. Well, if they didn't exist, the history of the world, or shall I say the current events of the world, would be extremely different. So they have to be recognized and understood. Another level, which is not very often looked on, is, shall we say, the earth unconscious, unearthed unconscious. That is to say, the part of you that is rooted in the soil you were born and grew up in. Now, guess what? If you are a people that have lived in the same place for thousands of years, this kind of earth consciousness and this race consciousness, or unconscious, if you will, are not differentiated particularly. Most people in European countries, their ancestors have been there for thousands of years, so they are a part of the land in a way that Americans, practically all of whom, except for the Indians, came here in the last 200 years, are not. Our shall we say, our earth consciousness and our national consciousness are deeply split. We are not integrated in this way. This is nobody's fault, but given that fact, and given the fact that people in the United States have come from so many different races, it's bound to cause a certain amount of tension. And again, this is not necessarily a good thing, but like all things that are not necessarily good, it's just as well to be aware of them, so at least they're not taking over, because this stuff takes over very, very easily. To invoke the classic case of Nazi Germany, Jung wrote a famous essay in 1936, which he called Wotan. And his argument in it was that the German people, who were then under the Third Reich, had been overpowered or possessed, I think is the term he used, by this Wotan consciousness, this old Norse god whose force, living here in the collective unconscious, slept but didn't quite go away. And, so these things awaken. For example, some of you may like horror fiction and are interested in the works of H.P. Lovecraft, where he speaks of these old ones, these old gods slumbering in the earth that have, awakened, that have slumbered for a long time and are being awakened and now manifesting again. Some people actually think these, act as if these gods are real, which is curious. But from our point of view, yeah, well, they are real in this sense, that these are forces deeply embedded in psyche. And of course, Lovecraft wrote most of his stories between the two world wars, when those forces were really operating in Europe. America was less affected by it, but still is to some degree. We're probably facing some kind of radical confrontation with the unconscious in this country now. Again, it wasn't my idea, but we better face it and see what's going on, see what forces are operating. Because none of the forces that you find negative, no matter what your views are anyway new. These have been around for a long, long time and are like Wotan resurfacing rather than being imported, newly made from China or whatever. Of course, what I'm talking about here is mostly the negative. I sort of lost my arrow. Oh, there it is. But there's also the positive side of the collective unconscious. Pride in one's people, pride in one's collectivity. These things are, again, not terribly honored these days, largely because things like racism and extreme nationalism over the last 100 years have literally killed tens of millions of people. So everybody's a bit shy of even admitting such things exist, but they do. And like all of these things, they can overpower you, a more conscious area down here, quite easily if you don't know what's going on. What do I mean? We've declared war. Boy, I'm going to join up right now. I can't wait. And if you read, particularly like the history of the Civil War, the First World War, all these men were like running to enlist right at the drop of a hat. 3 weeks before, it was a sleepy summer time. I'm talking about 1914. And then suddenly, everybody enlisted, everyone got sent to the front, and then lots and lots and lots of them got killed real fast. So that is the power of that. Well, I'm thinking about this World War I example. It sounds a little bit like the story of the angels at Mull. Ever hear of that? M-O-N-S, Mull. It was a battle in September 1914. And a British fiction writer wrote this story a month or so later and published it, in which these angels were seen fighting for the British, we're talking about the British here, at Mull. And he wrote it as a fiction story. But the magazine started getting all these letters from servicemen saying, yeah, we actually saw something like that there. Now, whatever people saw or didn't see, again, it's these forces being awakened that, that work their way down. It arguably can be seen as external manifestations, like seeing angels in the sky. A more famous example, more recent example is UFOs. Jung thought that these circular things were kind of attempts of the archetype of the self to manifest. And he was pretty agnostic about whether there really were such things, but he thought of it as being kind of like a psychic event, which he admitted could have external manifestations, meaning you could actually see UFOs in the sky, which people do. I don't understand it any better than you do. Except somehow I doubt it's all weather balloons. So now we're getting into the realm of the spirits. And it's this level here. It's the lower face of Bria, the world of the spirit, simultaneously the upper face of Yetzirah, the world of the psyche. This is where psyche and spirit overlap. We are now starting to talk about very, shall we say, impersonal forces in oneself. The spirit is not personal in the sense that we normally think of. One of the best examples of this is in the Gospels, where if you forgetting whatever you believe or don't believe about Jesus, you just read them as a narrative, he comes across as extremely impersonal. That is to say, he's kind, but it's not a kind of lovey-huggy kind of kindness. There's a certain almost remote quality. And whether Jesus was really like this in real life, neither I nor I suspect anyone else knows, but it is a manifestation of how kind of the spirit appears. As I said in a previous lecture, Tiferet is the Christ place. This is Binah, which could be the lawgiver form, which is sometimes associated with Moses. And this is Chokhmah, which is wisdom, which is connected with inspiration, as in prophecy. So Moses, the lawgiver, Elijah, the greatest of the prophets, and Jesus are all seen in the Transfiguration. That story in the Gospels is really it's talking about this. Again, without going into any question about whether such a thing really happened or not, which no one in this world knows the answer to, it is a symbolic echoing of this. And Da'at here is in the middle. Da'at is knowledge. The non-sphere, remember it's associated with Pluto, the non-planet. In a sense, it could be seen as kind of well, here's what I'm thinking. On standard shift cars, it's kind of like a little six system where there's 6 gears or 5 gears or however, and there's kind of a neutral place where you have to go to shift into another gear. Well, in a sense, Da'at is like that. It is a neutral place where forces, influences, often from a higher world, can come in. And it's a bit mysterious. To the level below it. So this is Ruach. Now, let us talk about personal immortality. We have here this vegetable level, a man plant. And this level does not possess immortality, just like the body that it's concerned with doesn't. If you look in the Bible, you will often see references to things like grass being cast into the oven. Well, grass in this sense, I think this is in somewhere in the Gospels, grass in this sense is this vegetative soul. That is not immortal. These personal unconscious elements are also not particularly immortal. Here, with the soul triad, you are dealing with things that, although of the psyche, are potentially immortal. And this part, the spirit, is what's immortal. Meaning, all this dies. Only at Tiferet of Yetzirah, which is the Malkut of Bria, do we find entities that are, shall we say, immortal, or at least potentially so. All of this is perishable. And in a way this is consoling, and in a way it's not, because, well, if you think about it, when you miss someone who dies, a lot of what you're missing is the personality. Well, a lot of the personality isn't going to survive, I don't think. I mean, too much of it has been conditioned by earthly life. Up here, yeah. Again, to go into the theosophical parallels, we're talking here about the etheric body, which, as we all know, is not immortal. The etheric body traditionally is said to die in about 3 days after the physical body, which is why most appearances of dead relatives to their survivors take place around then, because there's still enough, shall we say, energy left in that field to make itself felt, at least sometimes quite weakly. But it goes the astral level, the emotional side. It would seem from comparing all the traditions that it dies someplace between 40 and 49 days of death. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, you're supposed to read for the dead person up to 49 days. By then, it's gone on to where it's going to go on to, and you're not going to do it any more good by reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead to it. And as the Theosophists say, the astral body is not immortal either. It's only at these levels where you can equate with, shall we say, the causal level or the ego in theosophical terms that we talk about immortality. Something that survives birth and death and, is the part that reincarnates if the being reincarnates. And this is the level of the divine. In Yetzirah. this is an experience, shall we say, of cosmic consciousness. Ever hear of cosmic consciousness? Richard Buck, I think around the turn of the 20th century, published a famous book called Cosmic Consciousness, in which he described the exalted moments of many great spiritual figures, ranging from Jakob Böhme to Walt Whitman. And it is said that everyone has a glimpse, at least at this level, at least once in their lives. So it is said. I do not myself know that. By the way, what I've just done is illustrating an important Kabbalistic principle that would be good for all of you to remember, even if you forget all these charts and whatnot. I said something, it is said that, right? It is said that you reach, everyone gets a state consciousness. I did not say I know that. Nor did I just categorically assert that cosmic consciousness appears to everyone once in his or her life. Because, as a matter of fact, I don't know that. But if I say it is said that, yes, that is true. That is absolutely, it is said that. It is an absolutely categorically true assertion I can make. So in your language, it's often good, even in perfectly ordinary terms, to be able to distinguish when you're repeating something somebody said versus what you yourself know from your experience. It's perfectly legitimate. We all do it. Say someone said X, Y, and Z, or so and so said X, Y, and Z. But if you're just saying X, Y, and Z without attribution, you are taking responsibility for that statement in a sense. You are saying you know that, which may not be true. And since the Kabbalah is principally a way of knowledge, you want as much as possible only to be able to say things that you know to be true. In any case, so the divine, does rest at this level of the psyche. It's the starting point of the psyche. And it is wisdom, illumination. In this area, in the psyche, Chokmah is inspiration, prophetic inspiration, artistic inspiration. Quite spontaneous, quite dynamic, but also quite ephemeral. It's only if it can be coupled with understanding, Binah, that's capable of accomplishing anything. And again, this is a little fact that will explain a lot in your Bible, because constantly in the Bible, particularly the book of Proverbs, Chokmah, wisdom and understanding are paired. A lot of the book of Proverbs, Hebrew poetry was based on two parallel verses. He maketh me to lie down in green waters. He leadeth me. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters. It's the same idea phrased in a different way. And these parallel verses are often in Proverbs about wisdom and understanding. I don't know any off by heart at the moment to quote to you, but they're easily discovered. And that's because wisdom and understanding must be paired together. There's only understanding. Well, not much is going to happen there either, because, well, you understand something, so what? Even at a deep level, so what? It's the energy and the structure of the energy that underlies the psyche. A lot of this, and I will go into it more, at least a little bit next time, is the fact that these trees interlock in this way illustrates a great deal about it. The self, your high self, capital S self, is the Keter of your body. It's, as it were, the starting point of the physical body, but it is completely unmanifest. There is no place in the corpse where you can go dissect and find the self. It is, like Keter, as Keter always is, unmanifest. It is the center, the self, the primordial essential identity of the psyche. And it is the Malkut, in a sense, the embodiment of the spirit. So this is a very important, shall we say, point of interchange. And this is another one because it connects the upper three worlds in more or less the same way. But because, again, these are highly exalted states, it's hard to talk as much about them in terms of our own day-to-day experience. So, I come to the end of what I want to do this time. Next time, I think I will try to do something a little more experiential, among other things. You know, in terms of the charts and diagrams, this is mostly as far as I'm going to go. And as I say, you can get a sense of the tree by looking at all of these things in the psyche, about which you have at least some insight. I mean, I would assume people, you know, taking a course like this would, you know, have, shall we say, much more capacity for introspection and much more access to ordinarily unconscious levels than the typical person who generally not interested in. This has nothing to do with anything in terms of like education or social status or even intelligence. I have friends who are better educated and, you know, at least as intelligent as I am, who are completely uninterested in this. You might as well be, you know, a cat looking at a TV screen, you know, when I talk to them about it. As a result, I don't talk to them about it. Why? They don't want to hear about it. They certainly know what I do, and if they're interested, they can ask me. But otherwise, I just kind of let it go. Except for people who show some genuine and real interest, and I certainly have friends like that too. But your capacity for all of this is, again, very little to do. There are people with very, very high social status who are quite unconscious. And, you know, one could easily name examples from, you know, current events, but I don't think I'll do that. There are certain types who have some consciousness here, but it all goes into dominance. This is the sin of Tiferet is pride. Remember the 7 deadly sins? Greed, anger, pride, lust, sloth, envy, covetousness. Netzach is all about love and stuff. So, as a vice, if it is overemphasized or distorted in the character, manifests as lust. Tiferet is a sense of self. If this sense of self is aberrant, overemphasized, or, you know, damaged in some way or another, you see individuals with pride. Similarly, anger is the dark side of Gevura, and greed. Gluttony. Gluttony is the sin connected with Hesed. Gluttony, so you just want to expand and expand and expand until you could just burst. And this also illustrates something about the nature of evil, because some Kabbalists would say and have said that all evil is rooted in Gevura. I myself am not so sure. I tend to view it more in terms of what the system I've just explained, that evil is a distortion, an aberration, a dysfunction of any of these lower sphirot. And let's face it, we all are distorted and are dysfunctional at some level in some of these ways. The really gross examples are obviously the most easy to notice. So I'm going to stop here because it's, so any time for any questions to follow up on, or by the way, many Kabbalistic systems vary in some of these details. One of the ones where this particular system is exceptional is placement of the soul, ruach, and shama. A lot of Kabbalists would say this is the highest. I don't happen to agree, because it's quite clear that the level of the spirit is, as far as we're concerned, the highest level, and the rest is all, to some degree or another, of the psyche. But don't get confused if you read something that says the opposite. And it can be a problem if you're reading a lot of different Kabbalistic texts and works, because although the basic structure is similar, they will all talk about the 10 sefirot and the 4 worlds, for example. A lot of other details will differ. And the best thing to do, if you really want to pursue these studies to any great degree, is to learn one system well and absorb it well enough so you can say, yeah, well, this system says that, this other system says that, and all right, well, they just differ. Maybe this other system is, has its own insight, and no doubt it does. But if you try to reconcile them all together in kind of one grand picture, it's just going to be very frustrating and ultimately confusing. So, any questions? Well, I would say, since this is a course, if you want to get something out of this course, I would say it would be good to know this chart well enough, so say that you could draw it freehand. And this would be a lot harder to draw freehand, but it would be a good idea to have just an intuitive sense of structure. Anyone who really wants to do this in any serious way really ought to draw these, paint them. I mean, I myself have them on just sheets of unstretched canvas, painted in acrylics. I'll try to remember to bring one next time so you can take a look at it. They don't reproduce terribly well in this PowerPoint kind of thing, so I haven't actually made to use them practically, but you really will get it very, very much more deeply if you actually draw it or paint it it's something that you can keep. I mean, I made these almost 30 years ago. So, all right, I think if you really don't have any questions, I think we will sign off.